I personally think that it is very evident that our reality has been distorted, twisted, and manipulated by parasitic illusionists in such extended form and scale that it is hard at this point even to understand when it all started, when it all began. Let's talk a bit more about staged series. The more we dig into the events that were taking place in the 19th century, the more we uncover very relevant historical anomalies in the official narrative and timeline presented to us by the so-called educational institution. Strange late introduction of sanitation systems, even basic. Sudden enormous issues in waste management of cities, by the way with mysterious lack of sign of those waste issues in photograph of the same periods. Plenty of booms in social problem, although the city were pretty much the same size throughout the century. Odd lack of heating system in the main palaces and buildings of majestic cities, churches, cathedrals. In one of its amazing comments, the channel Whirled Publishing, who by the way is to me a magnificent and brilliant, let's call it climatologist, underlined the fact that these retarded are trying to make us believe that they were organizing social events in the middle of the St. Petersburg winter in palaces with issues in eating up the halls and rooms, and historically whining that they had to be cancelled. What a complete joke! And just to continue listing these historical anomalies of the 19th century, we have totally desolate streets and squares in photographs of every major cities throughout the planet. Empty or very low populated all the way to the 1860s. Lack of boat traffic in important harbors, rivers, canals. Basically lifeless ports throughout Europe, North America and Russia. All of these so-called anomalies are clearly observable during the second half of the 1800s. But before starting to talk about the horrific condition that supposedly our ancestors were experiencing in those times, let me add one more piece to this puzzle called staged reality. Puzzle that obviously, even if completed, will never resemble the picture shown on its box. It is with enormous honor that I present you the studies of two brilliant researchers. The respect that I have for their investigations is beyond description. Let me proudly present you Conspiracy Are Us.
Hello everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about foundlings. And what a foundling is it's basically an orphan, an infant that has been abandoned by its parents and taken cared for by others. So next what I'd like to do is talk about these foundlings in Victorian England. And I found a nice little article here talking about the Victorian women forced to give up their babies. Most unmarried mothers 150 years ago. This article is from 2015, so that puts us 1865 range. Most unmarried mothers 150 years ago had to hand over their babies to these foundling hospitals, which in the middle of the 19th century took in and raised the babies of fallen women. In the 19th century, foundlings, children abandoned by their desperately poor, typically unmarried mothers again, usually shortly after birth. Commonplace in European society, there were asylums in every major city to house abandoned babies. By the eve of the Civil War, so 1865, New York City in particular had an epidemic of foundlings on its hands. Due to the rapid and often interlinked phenomena of urban development, population growth, immigration, and mass poverty, only then did the city's leaders begin to worry about the welfare and future of its abandoned children. So again, this isn't an issue until like 1865. They're realizing, oh man, we have all these kids, what are we going to do? So you have all this infrastructure, everything's, all this infrastructure, all these buildings, but all of a sudden in 1865, all these foundlings, all these abandoned children, all of a sudden it's an issue. And again, I think this is all a cover story to account for why you have all these kids all being introduced into these cities. So let's take a look at what the heck were the orphan trains. The orphan trains were a series of social service programs that relocated poor and homeless city children. From 1854 to 1929, more than 200,000 children traveled by train from East Coast to seek new homes in nearly every state in the continental U.S. So I'm starting to think this isn't just some random event. This is just introducing all these kids into the new world, so to speak. And the timing, again, it's just really interesting to me because you have all the photos of these empty cities in the 1850s. So it's very interesting timing.
They were told, your parents are not your parents. Your past is not your past. Your life begins when you are chosen. The orphan trains began because a Methodist minister in New York City named Charles Loring Brace looked around the streets of New York and saw that there were 30,000 children living on the streets. They were getting run over, dying of starvation and exposure, going to jail, becoming criminals, they were becoming prostitutes. What we think of as Dickensian London is really what it was like then for poor people. Immigrants were pouring in, the Industrial Revolution was replacing jobs for poor people with machines, the Civil War was raging and creating vulnerable war widows. So there are many reasons that there were all these children on the streets. And Brace had this idea, it was sort of a glorified fresh air fund. He thought, if I can get children off the streets and send them to farms in the Midwest where labor is needed, maybe we can save their lives and maybe we can clean up the streets of New York. He worked with the train companies to send children on trains to the Midwest, and the trains each held between 10 and 30 children. And over the course of the next 75 years, over 250,000 children were sent to the Midwest. There were two ways that people got children from the orphan trains. The Foundling Hospital, which got into the act a little bit later, would put notices in newspapers around the Midwest, and people would write in and say, I'd like a blonde, curly-haired, blue-eyed, 7-year-old boy with a sweet disposition. And so they would look around and find that child and put him on a train, and then that person would be waiting on the other end. The Children's Aid Society had the children line up by height at a train platform or at a city hall or a Grange hall. Then farmers or whoever came would often, not unlike a slave auction, have them run in place, check their teeth, check their muscles, have them do even sit-ups or push-ups to make sure they were strong because they wanted workers. The farmers would take them off the stage and then fill out certificates taking ownership of the child. Contracts were signed between the people who took the train riders in and the organization, the Children's Aid Society or the Foundling Hospital, and it says, shall be indentured until the age of 21. These children were 2 to 14 years old. 21 is quite a long time to be working for someone else. The people who took in the train riders were required to send them to school, 4 months of schooling a year, to feed and clothe them. There was some language about treating them as you would one of your own. However, they were labor. For some of them, it was actually a form of slavery. Many of them had no choice but do what they were told to do. There were volunteers in communities who were supposed to check in on the children. That was rather spotty as a process. For one thing, they were volunteers. And because children were property, even if someone went out to check on a situation, it was much more likely that the adults would be believed than that the child would be believed. Furthermore, there was a great disincentive to take children out of homes because it was so hard then to know what to do with them. And so they would often leave children in situations that were not really the best for them.
This was a child migration scheme founded by this person in 1869, under which more than 100,000 children were sent from the UK to Australia, Canada, England, and South Africa. So all these Commonwealth countries here. So you've got massive amounts of children being sent to the United States, and then from New York being sent all over the place. You have all these kids from the United Kingdom. They're being shipped out to all these other places. And again, just real interest. And again, in this time frame. And what I'd just like to do now is just point out there was this Irish famine, orphans in Canada. Thousands of children became orphans during the 1847 Irish famine migration to Canada. It used to be called British North America. Children of the famine. The number of child migrants who became orphan in 1847 was unprecedented. By the year's end, thousands of children had become orphans. The exact number is hard to determine, given that many were informally placed out and left no trace in the record. Approximately 9 out of every 10 orphans were Catholic. So you had all these orphans, and there was no record of them. They couldn't be traced. And I think this whole thing is a cover story to account for a bunch of kids showing up. Now let's take a look at abandoned children of Imperial Russia. They established a couple of foundling homes in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And what I'd like to show you now is how it's not until the late 1800s where things really escalate. To give a clear idea, by the 1880s, the Moscow home alone was receiving between 16 and 18,000 infants annually, and sending over 10,000 of these each year to outlying district villages for care. So it reaches a fever pitch in the 1880s in the Moscow foundling home. In 1882, there were all told 41,000 foundlings from the Moscow home, living with 32,000 foster families scattered throughout 4,000 plus villages. So they're just like the United States, they're being deposited in these foundling homes in the major cities in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they're being distributed to the rural areas. And now let's take a look at Italy. Infant abandonment in Italy. Throughout Catholic Europe, infants were being abandoned in huge numbers in the 19th century, deposited at foundling homes established for their care. In France in the 1830s, about 32,000 infants were abandoned per year. In Spain and Portugal at this time, about 15,000 each. In 1887, over 20,000 babies were left at the foundling homes in St. Petersburg and Moscow alone. By the middle of the century, the number of infants left at Italy's foundling homes exceeded 35,000 per year. At the time, Italy had over 1,200 approved places at which newborns could be left. Why are there so many places for newborns to be left in the middle of the 1800s? What's going on? And even Vienna, the Vienna foundlings and orphans home. Between the Revolution of 1848 and 1868, around 30% of all children born in Vienna went into the Vienna foundlings home. Again, mid-1800s, 30%? Unbelievable. And just going back to the children in the United States, they were all put to work. You had children handing out newspapers. You had children working the mines. working cotton mills in the southern states, and factories, of course, home workshops. They're working the farms. And I think this whole phenomena of these foundlings is a cover story to account for all these children being reintroduced to these cities, and they're being just from the major hubs in these cities, they're being deployed to the rural areas. And it's an interesting rabbit hole for sure, but I guess I'll leave it here for now. But until next time, take care. Bye.
Is it only me, or all of this sound extremely creepy? What is going on here? Conspiracy Russ is really a brilliant and elegant researcher. His presentations are always leaving me mouth open. But I'm not going to comment yet this sad foundling situation, because to go deeper in this dark chapter of our supposed history, I will present you the studies of a magnificent researcher who has the gift to always surprise me with totally unexpected and mind-blowing presentation. He is actually the one that brought to our attention this full creepy scenario. Let me proudly present you Martin Lietke.
Yeah, so it threw me when these come up. So first you get like all the people of Britain of a certain age, myself, are born in Victorian hospitals. Like I'm 50. Okay, but these workhouses later were filled with these lot, even my local one. So there seems to be a real big load of the mentally infirm. Created, socially engineered. So the workhouses themselves, if you survive one, and they're all mud flooders people, all of them, so they're all from an older time, are filled with children, struggling, hungry looking children. They get them into one-room classrooms where they brainwash them, and that's the people with money, these ones. So where are the parents of all these children people? And why is there an abundance, which I'm going to show you now, blow your mind, of these orphanages, workhouses, where they work to death? It's just a lot of kids with no parents, wouldn't you say? Now, isn't the official narrative is that families had huge families, 8 kids each, because the kids were dying en masse, like because of the life expectancy was so low at this period. But I think that's a lie too. So this is the pattern. These places get built a long time ago. They at some stage are like type prisons. People hang around outside the workhouse. This is the one in Dublin. For their food. Okay, so they distribute food during the potato famine of 1840s. We know what time this is. Survivor times outside of workhouses. They are a big part of the story, people. Look at that one. On a giant wall. Where's that one? 1838. The new workhouse infirmary. Okay. All of them spoiling the same. It's in Wrexham. Islington in London. Southwell. Every single town, and they're all the bloody same. All is love. So there they all are in their workhouse, a load of children. 1 or 2 adults, indoctrinating them. And the rest are mentally ill, in debtors' prisons, etc. But there is 1 or 2 pictures, this one. And I thought, alright, shit, there's a load of old people. I thought, hang on a minute, the time period. This is a 1900 image, right? So there's a better one down here. I think that not one of these old men are above 70. So if that was 1900, 70 years before, 1830s, these were children. These were 30 after the events, or 20s after the events of 1811 through to 1815. Okay, what we think is a reset era. Sheffield, all these old hospitals, Cardiff Royal Infirmary, all of them were to hold large amounts of children, then on to the mentally ill. Okay, they are old, but they're not that old. They're 70 odd, and then they disappear. Okay, they die, leaving kids to fill the cities, the ones we see, and they're our great grandparents. But I think They're the purge survivors. Their parents were purged. Or they're brought in from somewhere else off pond. Look, Loughborough. It's a prison. Bird's eye view, again, a Surrey House of Correction, or is a prison, Wandsworth Prison. But at some stage, a lot of these prisons were actually workhouses. Clerkenwell, look at that outside, the mud, guys. Pentonville Prison. All these prisons are mud flood, they're all a big part of the story. And I'm thinking that they were, like, definitely more going on. Definitely.
This is getting creepier and creepier. The entire Industrial Revolution was man-powered mostly by kids. I've first heard of this piece of the puzzle in the works of the channel Furlock Furley, in which he was mentioning the enormous use of children employed in the industries during the 19th century. In one of his comments, he wrote, "So once we know from where all of those kids came from, we know from where we really are, who we are, what we are, and how we are. So from where did all of the children come from? There is something deeply wrong in the official narrative presented to us about the origins of all of those foundlings, and I'm very grateful for the contribution that Sir Martin Liedtke and Conspiracy Ras have given to the full picture. I can strongly recommend to follow their studies. I have 2 playlists on my YouTube channel presenting their works, and the links are in the descriptions. But let's continue. The first observation is regarding the Russian situation with foundlings, which started to get out of proportion in a later time of the 19th century. Here they are clearly talking about 1880s. If we bring back our 1861 photograph of St. Petersburg, completely desolated, we can just add another proof that even the kids issue had started as the waste management after those photos were taken, obviously leading us again to the conclusion that those cities were populated or repopulated in the late 1800s. But after listening to those really remarkable presentations, the number of foundlings, orphanages, workhouses, mental hospitals, totally out of place in those decades, I have contacted the channel Empowered by Knowledge to have an idea of the situation, for example, in Spain. And even if she couldn't tell me much more than what Conspiracy Ras have pointed out in his research, some 30,000 abandoned children per year between Spain and Portugal, no comment are needed. She sent me an article about one particular province of Spain on the border with Portugal, called Extremadura. In the article, they are mentioning the use of the word exposito for a socially accepted and regulated systematic abandon of children by their mothers. It was so widely spread that at some point every city had a house of expositos where the mothers could abandon their kids without being seen by the people in charge to basically collect them up. Why in the world, everywhere, more or less at the same time, the children abandon exploded in such dimension? Where all of those kids were coming from? That's a very good question, but certainly we know where they were going. In the various indoctrination and religious abusing centers, or so-called churches, workhouses, mental hospital, you name it. So if we stop for a minute to examine the various pieces of the puzzle that we have collected until now, we can start seriously speculating that some kind of reset or new beginning took place in those times. But what have actually restarted? What have began or re-began in those years? Well, a lot of answers are again contained in the so-called history of Finland. To start, I would like to point out a fact that Sir Martin have highlighted brilliantly. If you go look at pictures from 1890s to 1900 in Finland, you will barely find people around 50 years old. Forget about older. I'm not saying that there aren't any, but we went through really a lot of old photographs for these videos, and it is a very easy to observe matter of fact that there are no old people around, as you can appreciate, for example, on the screen, obviously fitting in the panorama of the huge number of kids during the 1850s and 60s that we have researched earlier. But what is really incredible is that in other countries they were trying at least to make the situation foggy with lies and fake events. But in Finland, they didn't even bother to hide that everything started in those decades. Let's stay for a few more seconds in the same context. Let's talk about foundlings in Finland during the 19th century. The situation is horrific as everywhere else. Since the early decades of 1800, kids were sold as slaves to families who were willing to take them with the lowest monetary offer. The condition and the treatment of the young slaves are not even hidden. Just to mention a few examples of the atrocious situation, they were sleeping on the floor, they were given very small amount of food, working as maniac, often beaten, and they were not allowed to talk. In this article, for example, they mentioned that the condition of poverty of those child slaves was so severe that due to the lack of simple shoes, they had to heat up their frozen feet with their own urine. What is going on here? Obviously, as in the other countries, the reason behind all of these foundlings are given to poverty and other various social problems. You cannot really find a logical reason to account for this enormous number of kids appearing throughout Europe and other areas of the world and basically being slaved and indoctrinated. On the screen, we were having articles and illustrations presenting the use of young workers in mines around Europe. But the foundling slave situation of Finnish people goes way back. As we can read on this article titled Finnish Children in the Slave Markets of Crimea, the most prized of all varieties of slave, however, appear to have been children brought all the way to the Crimea from the far north. Boys and girls who were perhaps between 6 and 13 years old, who had been seized in organized raids on the Finnish district of Karelia. Very interesting are the numbers given to us. Girls could be resold for 6,666 altin, a markup in excess of not 100,000%, but 133,000%. I wonder if the person that wrote this article had his hand hidden under his coat. But let's leave behind for the moment this creepy kid scenario, and let's start to put order in the Finnish timeline. Surprise, surprise, in 1860s started the so-called National Awakening. What a coincidence that it matched perfectly the time frame of the cities being populated or repopulated, as visible in the many various photographs of that exact period. But it can be only just a coincidence. So what they are telling us is that during this National Awakening, every kind of institution started to appear. Obviously, all of the indoctrinational systems started. School and sport centers were used to educate young people in so-called discipline and order. Till 1874, when the public education took a step forward and started to organize a systematic education operation, basically systematically brainwashing. It is all very well documented. Another interesting phenomenon that just happened to appear at the same exact time is the surname system. They are clearly telling us that people didn't have Finnish surname till 1850s. Then, surprise, churches and school teachers started to give surnames to the kids. What a coincidence, in 1850s. But let's continue looking for historical anomalies and connecting more dots. In one of my previous videos, I've mentioned the strange lack of old graves. I've been researching this issue for quite a while, and let's find out at which date the old graves are pointing out. It is at least interesting in the case of Finland that visiting the various so-called old cemeteries, in fact they all belong to the 20th century, you can find a big number of grave markers starting from, surprise, the 1840s and 50s. They certainly and visibly largely increase in number after that decade. But in any case, all of the graves are from the 20th century, and very rarely and questionably before that age. Let's add an observation. The names of the deceased prior to 1840s, they share, coincidentally, strangely way too many similarities. In the same small town cemetery, you can find 2 or 3 Anna or Erik or Henrik, even belonging to 2 or 3 decades of difference. And the odds of having only few beginning of 1800 names on graves, and over 5 or 6 of them, you have 3 Carolinas, to me it is at least fishy. But let's stop speculating and go and call straight the responsible for the listing of the deceased in Finland. They will tell us what is going on. On the screen at this moment you have the Genealogical Society of Finland official website that tells us graves are sometimes destroyed by parish authorities because of economic reasons. Cool. Let's continue. Many of the old graves had wooden grave markers which have disappeared because of natural causes. Now, let's stop thinking for a minute. Would you put a wood marker on top of your deceased loved one, knowing that winter after winter will be covered by meters of snow melting and rotting the marker? Even for a dog, we would put a stone to keep his memory alive. Having trouble digesting the wood markers nonsense, I will go look for answers straight to the stone grave markers creators, who are telling us that till 1822, people who were wealthy were buried under the church's floor to have their limestone markers visible and preserving their memories. They obviously talk about stones, not wood markers, and in any other article mentioning the studying of the use of cemeteries around the churches in early 1800s, there are no mention of the use of wood markers, because it's not logic to put wood in the snow in memory of your family members, period. But there is a reason behind the missing proof of the appearance and lack of old graves in Finland. Because just by coincidence, most of the old cemeteries had been destroyed and relocated before 1890s. What a surprise! To give you more evidence, in one of my previous videos I presented you the research of a guy called Faris El-Shaer. The New Earth channel brought his study to my attention. He was pointing out that examining the dates of the old graves in Zagreb, capital of the beautiful Croatia, he could not find any older date than the 19th century. What, people they were not dying before? Then suddenly, while excavating for gas pipes or water systems, they uncover old graves everywhere in Europe, buried under 8 or 10 meters of dirt or mud. But who would excavate such amount of earth to bury bodies? This whole story of old cemeteries is very foggy, but we will talk more about the strange lack of old graves in the future. Therefore, I encourage the viewer to share info on this topic. But let's continue. We were at the National Awakening of 1860s. The achievements of the period were not only related to social development, but obviously infrastructure of every kind start to pop up everywhere as well. Roads, canals, and a railway system coincidentally all starting at the same time, in 1860s. Let's start with the railways. As we can see on this illustration, one of the first railway lines, built around 1862, was connecting the city of Hämeenlinna and Helsinki to Viborg and St. Petersburg. Do you remember in the video of Conspiracy Ras when he was mentioning the distribution technique used to spread all of those kids from Moscow and St. Petersburg to rural areas? Well, I wonder if the first train rail connecting those cities was used for the distribution of those children toward Finland, on top of other possible repopulation uses that they could have with it. But I'm just speculating. But being already on the path, let's talk a bit about railway so-called construction in those years. Do you remember in the previous part of this video when I showed you an amazing work of translation from Philippe Druzhinin? He was pointing out with these images that in Russia many railways were dug out and evidently not built. As you can clearly see, the work of digging is very evident. And in all of these other photographs from Siberia, belonging to around 1890s, we cannot really see any substantial proof of any train line construction works, but more restoring the previous system. But it looks like it's not only a Russian phenomenon. On the screen at this moment, we can appreciate some old photographs from various locations in Italy. And as we can see, again, more than constructing tunnels and railways, looks like they are restoring previous damaged, or like in this case, mud-flooded, railway lines. But I will talk more about trains in another part of this video, because I'm waiting to see some documents about the supposed construction of one of the most important train stations in Europe. Let's go back to the National Awakening. So railways were starting their breakthrough. We will talk in a moment about who was building them and why. But just to create a bit more slavery jobs, why not creating a canal that stretched for dozens of kilometers connecting the city of Lappeenranta with St. Petersburg? It is called the Saimaa Canal. The official narrative of its construction is pure nonsense, without even mentioning that it's an insult to the human mind. On the screen you can appreciate some images showing this enormous work of masonry. Please just look at the embankments or the deepness, without even mentioning the length, stretching through swamp, hills. And what they are trying to tell us is that in 1845 the construction started, and in 1856, 11 years later, it was magically open to the public. What an absolute hoax! Just look at the countless blocks that are part of the canal's walls or embankments. And by the way, supposedly at the same time, Finland was sending gigantic monolithic columns to St. Petersburg by barges, enormous countless blocks for the embankments of the Russian canals and bases of buildings and palaces. The various illustrations shown on the screen are giving us an idea of the proportion of the fairy tales printed in our history books. But let's now talk about who's behind the construction of all of those railways and canals, and why they were willingly participating in it. It was all part of an enormous slavery process, conducted mainly by foundlings, homeless, landless, every kind of poor or beggars, in exchange for food. They were basically working till death. Now, before getting to talk about the reasons behind an enormous food crisis or famine in the late 1860s that brought this food slavery chain to blow out of proportion, I will just add a couple of small observations regarding road systems, which were also rapidly increasing in those decades. I will bring back again the work of translation done by Philip Druskinin. In it, he was showing this road connecting Pskov, Russia, to the Latvian capital Riga. As you can clearly see, there are sections that are completely straight. I mean, unhumanly straight. Here we have another example of a totally straight road stretching for dozens of kilometers. Well, what I did a few weeks ago was going to see that road personally and take my own conclusion. It is exactly like you see it on the maps, completely straight. As you can clearly see, the line that has been supposedly cut through the forest and that formed the road surface is at least the double, or at places triple, of the size that it is in use for the road. And the electric poles on the side of it are carrying maximum 2 or 3 cables, obviously showing us that there is no need for such large forest cleanup for the old lines. The idea that somebody would cut double or triple the size of forest, by the way, maniacally straight. What about hills, swamps? Nothing. Completely straight. Needed for a road, then taking off all of the tree stumps for dozens or hundreds of kilometers for nothing is dementia. Nobody would do that. It's a total waste of time, space and money. But this old straight road system affects obviously also Finland. But let's not talk about the south of the country, obviously much more developed, but the northern desolated lands of Lapland. As we can clearly observe, the normal daily roads are following the terrain, and they are visibly full of curves, like it should be in a giant swampy area as the Finnish Arctic. But these roads are totally and completely straight. This one in particular is clearly crossing swamps, hills, lakes. I mean, find me a woodcutter that can tell you that he can do the same, going perfectly straight on swamps, without even mentioning that it doesn't make any sense to do so. And what about this gigantic forest cleaning? Can you see those enormous rectangular fields? Nothing growing them. What are they? Who made them? But we will see tons of lines and canals in the next part of this video. Therefore, let's have a look at airports. Again, I will use the magnificent work of translation from Sir Philip. The link is in the description. In this video, we can appreciate the famous Yundum Airport of Gambia. I think that everybody knows about its mysterious origins. Nobody really built it. Even in old British documents, there are mentions of it being restored, but not built. The old runway is much longer than what has been fixed, and it is very well known that under the new asphalt, the old airport was made of some kind of giant stone blocks. But in the same video, Sir Philip was pointing out that that's not the only case. Here we can appreciate another airport restored in smaller section compared to the real old enormous one. It is located in the Chukotka Peninsula of Russia. Can you see that long straight canal on top of the structure? Keep it in mind. But let's go back to my recent expedition in the Baltic lands. Out of the city of Liepaja, located on the coast of the amazing country of Latvia, we can appreciate a small airport. Do I have to comment the fact that it is evidently built on a much bigger and older base? But what is really interesting is that, again, close to it, we can see these straight canals. But as I said, we will get bored of canals and old earth lines in the next part of this video. I think that at this point we are going way too far from our daily lives topic, which is researching the historical period called the National Awakening, or as I would call it, the Reset. Here is when everything got out of control. Starting already in the late 1850s, one of the most severe famine in Europe affected the Finnish society. On the screen we can appreciate a list of famine clearly highlighting with the Irish one, which occurred a few decades earlier, the famine of Finland as one of the strongest in Europe during the 19th century, killing 15% of the entire population. So let's have a look at this historical event. Nothing makes any sense. They are telling us that the food problem began already in the late 1850s, but at the same time the national awakening has started. I'm confused. Which kind of awakening can have a starving society? They were increasingly getting hungry, but they were building every kind of enormous structure like the one on the screen. They are telling us that the railway system is dedicated to the memory of the Great Famine of 1866, 67 and 68. In fact, those are the official dates of it getting out of control. But the main railway lines were built several years earlier or several years later. But let's go deep in this event. What created the famine was poor potato and carrot harvest. The grain production was much lower than the average of the period, and the freezing weather was affecting the importation from other countries. Let's start with the lack of food. Do you know why I live in Finland? Because I know that whatever dark could happen with humans, I can walk in this wild forest and survive. I don't have very clear yet the process of smoking meat or fish for its conservation, also because I almost don't eat meat, but I have learned plenty of tricks to build a sustainable environment. On the screen you are contemplating the enormous variety of food sources that this land can offer in the total wilderness. So what about the Sami tribes? They are considered the only left, let's call it, wild society in Europe. They live in the entire Arctic region of the Finnish and Swedish Lapland, all over the Kola Peninsula and thousands of square kilometers of the Russian forest. These amazing tribes, I had the honor in my life to live many months in their territories, can survive almost anything. Nature and the spirit of their lands give them everything. How come they can survive in the wilderness? And I know dozens of Finnish people that if you leave them in the woods, they come out selling grass to the reindeers. And the 15% of the entire population of Finland died of starvation in 3 years. By the way, on the screen you have a graphic of the age-specific mortality rates during the famine. Interesting that no kids were dying. Do you remember the condition the kids were experiencing in those times? I wonder if this whole famine story have anything to do with justifying the enormous amount of kids in those decades. And I can tell you that I've been looking deeply into it, with the help of Finnish researchers that were baffled to see so much nonsense speculation on how it actually could have happened. They are telling us that Finnish people were not fishing in lakes until after the famine, and they were even saying that they couldn't make holes in the ice to fish. Give me a break. These guys, they could cut gigantic monolithic blocks, transport them for kilometers, carve them in the largest monolithic columns in the world, and by the way, several decades earlier, and they had problem making holes in the ice to fish. What an absolute hoax. Should I continue? Let's talk about mushroom. In Finland, there are 2,000 species of mushroom. I can tell you, it's mushroom land. Of these 2,000, 500 are eatable, and a large part of them are highly proteic. So how come they were starving in August, September, October, without even mentioning that you can dry them? But I know the answer. In those years, the winter was so severe that mushroom didn't grow. I found it very hard to believe due to the enormous quantity of them scattered in every different kind of Nordic environment. Drier or swampier, colder or sunnier. No mushroom at all. And what about chaga mushroom? That's superfood. It grows on trees despite the weather. What, they didn't have the wood to boil the water and extracting the properties? I'm not saying that you can live only on chaga, but it is a very well-known supplement for a rich diet. But the answer is in the history books, because Finnish people don't eat mushroom. I'm not joking. They were introduced to the use of mushroom as food source during the famine. I can't continue. I can go on for an hour giving you proof that the Finnish famine narrative is a sad or horrific cover story. Because between endless slaves, national awakening, and offensive famines, historians leave on the side the most important result of all of those decades of supposed suffering. Finland ended up in the hand of the Rothschild family, whom with love came to rescue Finland's people from the famine, borrowing 6 million from his own pocket. What a sweetheart. From that moment on, the entire economy and food chain was under their control. I personally think that it could have invented much less twisted lies to put in the history books that Finland was completely owned by parasitic bloodlines. But if we look at the full picture, they are not even trying to hide that in 1874 started a systematic education operation, and at the same time Rothschild banks were taking over the entire economy and food chain. To me, it looks like that the national awakening of Finland was in reality the beginning of a project called FinLab. The whole concept of the famine is printed in our history books for the only purpose of making us accept the condition of slavery that we are evidently experiencing in our days, making us think that it has always been like that our ancestors were submitting and accepting slavery in exchange for food. By the way, in all of those images from 1850s and 60s Finland, do you see any sign of one of the strongest famine in Europe? But let's turn page and continue researching historical anomalies during the 19th century. Let's have a look at forest ages. This piece of the puzzle is a strong evidence that something deeply important had happened in the first half of 1800, and I've chosen this particular topic to start introducing the next part of this video, which will be entirely dedicated to research the catastrophic event that obviously took place at the beginning of the 19th century. But let's move to the Baltic countries. I have personally visited in multiple occasions most of the Lithuanian and Latvian national parks. And trust me, there is a lot going on in those amazing natural environments. As we can read on the screen, Lithuania's 5 national parks are representative of the country heritage, history and diverse natural landscape, providing refuge to endangered plant species, 200 years old trees, foxes, wolves, and numerous bird species. As we can clearly read, the oldest forests and trees of Lithuania belong to the first half of the 1800s. What a coincidence. But let's have a look at Latvia. The Dzintari Forest Park, for example, tells us that it has 200 years old pine groves surrounding the park. Again, the same situation. The oldest forest and trees are telling us that something obviously took place in the first half of the 1800s. But let's have a look at Finland. As we can read on the screen, the oldest trees are around 150-200 years old. I'm not saying that there aren't older trees, but they are found only on islands or strange areas that create some natural protection around them. As we can appreciate on this various old photograph of Finland's forest, shot by our iconic geologist and movie director, Sir Frosterus, and mostly belonging to the last decade of 1800, the age of the trees is very young. You cannot find any picture of those times showing sign of old wild woods. But this strange lack of old forest does not interest only the area of the Baltic countries or Finland. As we can read on this article from the website stolenhistory.org, highly recommended, there's a link in the description to their remarkable works. Apparently, the age of the Siberian forest is estimated to be around or under 200 years. The lifetime of the Siberian pine can reach up to 850 years. There are plenty of other trees out there whose lifespan 500 to 600 years. Yet the Siberian forests are estimated to be approximately 200 years old. So what happened to this world 200 years ago that we cannot remember? Some enormous event took place at the beginning of the 19th century, and the forests are just giving us more proof of it. On the screen we can appreciate some photographs taken in the first decade of 1900, showing the epicenter of the Siberian Tunguska event. The channel Conspiracy Ras has covered this topic in great details, and you can find his video also in a playlist on my YouTube channel. Obviously, the age of the trees in those remote Russian areas is again visibly very young. And in all of these other photographs belonging more or less to the same period, we can contemplate again the total lack of aged forest throughout the vast Siberian lands. All of those trees are pointing at the first decade of 1800. But let's continue. Just to make this already creepy presentation a bit darker, I will add an observation. Can you see these black hat figures that are appearing on various, to me, staged old photographs of Finnish quarries? Well, those, to me, parasitic people are all over the places in the 1800 pictures, faking stone cutting techniques, staging the use of mining site to fit in their historical hoaxes. In fact, as we can clearly see, nobody's working. They are just posing for the camera. But of course, it was Sunday. But you can also see them controlling or slavering those foundling that we were talking about earlier. This image, I think, is from Britain. These black hat people looks like they are the directors of the various orchestras. Here we can see them staging the so-called construction of the Theatre of Zagreb, capital of Croatia, in 1890s. It is very evident in these photos that nobody's building anything, maybe fixing, but the entire scenario is clearly a complete theater. But let's continue talking about buildings, mansion, and other creepy masonry achievement of the era. On the screen at this moment, you can appreciate some photographs of various mansions that are located a bit everywhere, again, throughout the Baltic countries of Latvia and Lithuania. The reasons why I keep focusing on this particular lens will become more transparent along with the various presentations. As we can clearly observe, they all share the same issues with the ground level. Let's call them mud-flooded. But we will talk extensively about it in the endless next part of this video. For the moment, let's bring out few aspects of them. They are all made with the same small red bricks, everywhere. All of the main buildings of every town, train stations, city halls, they are all made of those red bricks. As we can clearly see in these images, those buildings have plastered on them every kind of fancy decoration. They were plastering the bases and made them look like big stone blocks, horizontally lined up on top of each other. At the edges of the building or entrances, they were plastering fake columns-looking decorations. They were, let's say, making them look like they were for rich selected people. But the reality is that they were all made of these simple quality red bricks that supposedly were maniacally produced during the entire Industrial Revolution. Also, churches were built in the same poor style, small bricks with some fancy decoration here and there. If we bring back the fact that many of those churches and mansions' heating systems were added in a later moment, so originally they weren't designed for winter conditions, and we add to that this fake plastering of ornaments, we could start speculating that those structures were used for some other foggy purposes than just living and pray. And I think there are a few ideas of which kind of artifacts and art could have been hidden in them for, let's say, future manipulation of history. I can strongly recommend the video from Conspiracy Ras about the Gilded Age mansion, which covers this fishy presence of those buildings in North America and what's contained in them. Just to add an observation, these are some of the symbols that are scattered around those buildings. You can find those symbols basically all over Latvia and Lithuania. And talking about occult messages, do you remember this 1860s photograph of Helsinki that I presented you in the previous parts of this video? I wonder if the letters posed against the walls have some kind of meaning, like a signature that the picture is staged. But let's go back to our red brick structures. What I found interesting about those mansions in Lithuania, by the way, just look at the dimension of those buildings, is that they are connected with each other by kilometers and kilometers of man-made underground tunnels that in our days are flooded. I have a few questions in my mind. Why did they make them? How did they excavate them? When did they do that? What were they hiding down there? The full picture is very obscure to me. But what if those tunnels were created for nothing? What if they were useless? But I know the answer. This guy's totally flipping out. How come somebody built endless tunnel system for nothing? What a joke. Really. A channel of a subscriber, which I would like to call friend, due to the enormous contribution that he's giving to this project, sent me some articles about the construction of a really dark structure belonging to the 19th century. Sir Ziggy Dunn was pointing at the Williamson tunnels of the city of Liverpool, England. Apparently, this Joseph Williamson, between 1810 and 1840, started building some countless miles of tunnels under the city streets for seemingly no purposes. After becoming extremely wealthy with the tobacco business, Williamson got interested in one particular road, named Mason Street, in which he started to build mansions with an extra basement. I call them mud-flooded, but let's continue. After the constructing of all of those mansions, he decided to start this enormous, seemingly useless series of tunnels, with the purpose of giving work to the large number of unemployed after the Napoleon Wars. So what they are telling us is that supposedly he was digging gigantic tunnels, holes and cavities for the only reason of giving jobs to the people. Does it make any sense to you? It's the same story as the Finland's ghost station that I presented you in the first part of this video. They are building some 200 kilometers of totally useless, meaningless tunnels under the street capital. Is it only me or all of this sounds insane? By the way, on this picture we can see again those black hat people posing for the camera. But if we start looking at the full picture, there are actually seemingly totally useless tunnels under every city in the world. Well, I think I will leave this presentation here, because it is really starting to creep me out. But before, I will read you an amazing comment that an awesome subscriber posted under the previous video. Thanks for watching and listening. The love and respect that I have for all of you, my family, is beyond words. Madame Sylvia wrote, "Actually, there are tunnels under every major city in the world. They begin at Tel Dan, near Mount Hermon, and they were used to hide their evil activities, burials, catacombs, and to travel unhindered. In Kiev, the Russian Orthodox Church sealed off the entrance to their segment of it, because people would go in out of curiosity and never been seen again. Sometimes there were reports of people screaming, but those people would never came out again. One person reported that he'd gone down there on an official tour before the church sealed it off, and he said it was extremely slimy and dark, of course, but he saw thousands of skulls, cleaned and polished, lining the walls from floor to ceiling. They were told that cannibals lived down there, descended of the Canaanites, who were descended from the fallen angels, who made with the Canaanite women and produced the giants.